So today's Backstage is a special kind of encore performance of the May 13th program that featured Joel Schechter and Chris Rohmann talking about satire in theater. Joel and Chris are both experienced in and knowledgeable about satire, and their discussion of theater was scholarly, collaborative, and insightful. It was a terrific episode, which to our shame, we neglected to record. So we're delighted that they've agreed to this special encore performance, which we will not fail to record. Not wanting to repeat their May performance, their topic for this episode is theater writing. And we've invited a few interested people. We're delighted that you'll join us and provide a lively audience for Joel and Chris. To remind you briefly, Joel is Emeritus Professor of Theater and Dance at San Francisco State, where he taught courses in theater history, dramatic literature, dramaturgy, playwriting, and popular theater. He also served as chair of theater arts, coordinated the MA program, and directed plays by Brecht, Aleichem, Brodsky, and others. Much of his work is directed toward the study of satire, and he's written many, many books, including Clowns,
Family circus clowns in San Francisco, Jeff Hoylbiller and John Mankin and others. I wrote a little book about Russian circus clowns called the Congress of Clowns. I made several trips to Moscow, was even a fellow at Moscow University when I did my research. It was kind of funny to be a research fellow studying circus clowns. I wrote a book called Satiric Impersonations from Aristophanes to the Gorilla Girls, which is about a number of satirists. And at the very bottom, I don't know if you can lift up the pictures, there's one more book called Durov's Pig, and it's about circus clowns and political satire. One reason I wanted to talk about this topic with Chris is that I know everyone here has worked in the theater, but sometimes writing about the theater is not appreciated. I know those within the field sometimes are angry at critics, critics for just writing what they don't know about,
right,
or what doesn't seem to understand a production. But the kind of writing I've been interested in and tried to create over the years is historical, and also I've specialized in forms of theater that are either endangered or less discussed in criticism and history than I think they should be. That includes circus clowning and political satire. And also for me, writing about theater is a form of advocacy. I've tried to write about artists whose work I regard as not only historically important, but something that is to be learned from and ideally emulated, or the essays that are written might inspire artists or stimulate them to create new works similar to or continuing on from those that went before them. And I can give you some specific examples of what I mean by advocacy, but I want to give
Chris time
I wanted Chris to talk about what he's been writing before I go on to say more about theater writing as advocacy.
Well,
okay.
Okay, as soon as you said the word advocacy, I said absolutely, and it'd be interesting to talk about that from our different viewpoints. I wrote for the Valley Advocate for 36 years, as Paula said, and it's a regional weekly. It's not weekly anymore because of the state of the publishing industry, but it's a news and arts weekly, kind of our area's equivalent of the Village Voice, or the alternative paper in our area, which is the Pioneer Valley of Western Massachusetts, centered on Northampton, which is where I live now. And so it's a comparatively small community, although I've had, somewhere between hundreds and thousands of readers over the years for the columns that I write. And so I really try to be, I'm speaking in the present tense because I stopped writing this column only a few months ago. But as a critic, I always tried to be fair because and explain myself. The hardest reviews I ever wrote were largely negative reviews. If I wanted to be really critical of a production and thought it deserved that, it was really hard to do because I felt like I had to justify myself and make it clear also to the reader that this is my opinion. I didn't explicitly point out that this is my opinion, but I tried to weave that in to all of my pieces. And part of the reason why I wanted to be so careful in reviews was because I didn't know who was reading my stuff for the most part, but I knew that the people who I was writing about were reading my stuff.
Uh-huh.
And I was in the locker room one day getting undressed, and one of the actors who I had just sort of panned was in there too. But he understood what I was saying. I think the best compliment I ever had was from the director of the Theater Works Theater in Hartford, Connecticut, who said, we don't always like what you write. We don't always agree with you, but you always get it, what we're trying to do. And that was the best thing I ever heard.
Yeah.
So as far as specific advocacy goes, there's a lot of little theaters in the Valley. There are big summer theaters over in the Berkshires, and I've covered them over the years. And I'm kind of tend to be harder on them, quote unquote, because I try to review people, the companies, shows in terms of their pretensions. So if they are a fully professional equity company, fancy theater and all of that, I expect more. I'm not going to say, well, this production was lousy because it was a college production, because it's all a matter of the context and what are you trying to accomplish, and what resources do you have to accomplish that. So I haven't been a cheerleader for local theater, but I've tried to cover everything that's worthwhile and trying to do things in a professional way. And I've gotten a lot of kudos for that. I must say that people feel that I'm an advocate for the theater scene in our region. So if you want to talk a little more about advocacy, Joel, please do.
No, thank you. I think the kind of writing you've done is a service to a theater community and to readers who want to know what they could see and what they have seen from your perspective. I tended to write and continue to write about things people can't see, or in part because the artists are no longer around, or the kind of satire and circus satire and stage satire that I would like to see is not being performed. And this is, for me, where advocacy comes in theater history, because in the past there have been what to me are fascinating performances, which I didn't see, but I have read about and done research on. And I wanted to give a few examples of those, which can be found in my books. In several books on satire, I talk about Aristophanes and his play, The Knights, which was performed in 424 BC in front of an audience of 17 to 20,000 for one performance only. And it was a satire directed against the tyranny, the bullying of a civic leader, or you might call him a tyrant, named Creon, K-R-E-O-N or C-R-E-O-N. who was in his own way undemocratic in a somewhat democratic city-state. And the story goes that Creon is impersonated in the satire by an actor who represented this civic leader. Mask makers were afraid to make a mask of this man because he was so tyrannic. So the legend is that Aristophanes played the role himself and smeared his face with wine dregs to look like Creon, and he couldn't get a mask made. And in the plot of the play, the comedy, the satire, this tyrant is challenged by a man on the street, a sausage seller. They debate, and the sausage seller proves to be rougher, more brutal, wittier, and he wins the debate with the stand-in for Creon. And the audience would have been laughing at the insults, the abuse, the invective directed against this civic leader or his stand-in, while Creon himself sat in the front row and had to endure 17,000 people laughing at his stand-in. One historian says that as a result of this, Creon was removed from office, but I don't think it's true. In fact, he harassed the playwright Aristophanes, but Aristophanes continued to ridicule Creon later in other plays. I want to give one other example, if you'll let me go on for a minute. And this, Susan, if you can show the photo of Dario Fo. This is a more contemporary example of satire that I would like to see emulated or at least rivaled by others. Dario Fo, some of you may have heard of him, is an Italian satirist who lived from 1926 to 2016. He won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1997. I had the privilege of meeting him and spending time with him several days in the 1980s. And I have a lot to say about him. I'll try to limit it. I've written a number of essays about him in my books. But first of all, I knew him before he won the Nobel Prize, but he was already famous in the 1970s. He was very well known in Europe for his satiric theater, his one-man shows. His wife, the actress Franca Rame, also did one-woman shows. They satirized political leaders, corruption in government, but also the Catholic Church. At one point, his plays were sponsored by the Communist Party, but then he satirized the Italian Communist Party, so they disowned him. At one point, he and his wife had a very popular television show, sort of like Saturday Night Live, but they were asked to submit to censorship. They refused. They left television and did only live theater, which they controlled. It was their own collective theater company. They toured Italy. They had very large following because they were already known from television. Around 1979, 1980, Foas and Franca Rame were invited to perform in New York, and the State Department denied them entry because allegedly they supported terrorism. In fact, they had founded a legal defense fund to defend those accused of terrorism. A little like if you know the situation in Atlanta, Georgia, this past week, a legal defense fund for Atlantans accused of domestic terrorism was raided by the police. It's that kind of situation that Fo experienced in Italy, and our State Department said he's a terrorist. So they wouldn't let him into the country around 1980. So I decided if they won't let me see him, I'm going to Italy. I went there with my wife, Diana. We hitchhiked across Italy. It was a great.
Lost you again.
Town called Gubbio, a beautiful medieval village. And we got there early in the day. They were erecting a wooden stage By evening, this platform stage was surrounded by thousands of people who had come from miles and miles around to see Faux and Rame perform their one-person shows. The audience loved this performance. They used only microphone and their voices and bodies, satire of church, state, marriage, all sorts of physical comedy, mime, funny stories. So I met him, and also I should mention, am I going on too long? I have a long.
No, it's fine. Go ahead.
I had also had some interest in his plays before this. I was at Yale teaching and editing a theater magazine, and I published one of his plays of Accidental Death of an Anarchist, which is about police murder of an innocent man accused of terrorism. And I had sent him a copy of this publication. And I don't know if you can see it on screen. I have a letter from him. He sent in 1980 to me. He said, "Dear Joel, I'm sorry not to have answered before your kind letter. Thank you for the article you sent and for your support. I hope to see you in the USA in the next future." His English wasn't perfect, but that was 1980. So here I was seeing him in Italy. And since I was at the Yale and the Yale Rep, I kept lobbying for them to do a play of his. They did a play around 1983, and it went pretty well. And a friend of mine named Ron Jenkins came and saw the play, and he said, "Oh, this Stereo Faux is really interesting. I'm going to Italy to see him." So Ron went off to Italy, stayed for 6 months, and he learned Italian. And then finally in 1985, when the ban on Faux and Rame was reversed by the State Department, Faux invited my friend Ron to be his onstage translator. And Ron called me up and said, "Joel, should I do it?" I said, "Yes." So because my friend was the translator of Faux and Rame's first American tour, I had a chance to meet with him several times. We arranged, among other performance venues, for him to come to Yale, where I was the host for a week. And we got to talk to him. And it was just, a satirist's heaven for me. Because, and I bring this up because it relates to advocacy. I started out by publishing one of his plays and writing essays about the merits of his satire. Within 5 years, I was hosting his performance in a repertory theater. And for me, this was, like the highlight of my writing career, in the sense that the writing, I did not single-handedly get the State Department to reverse its ban, but I managed to get this subversive comic satirist, not only to the United States, but to the theater where I was working. And some of it was due to my writing and the advocacy of his form of theater. So I cite this as an example of the kind of writing I'm very glad I was able to do.
I can't say that my writing ever attracted any famous playwrights, although I've met several in the course of doing it.
They were asking me, what play should we do next season? And I said, how about Dario Fo? Here's a script. So again, it was more than writing. I was reading plays and writing about them. But also, if you don't know his satire, I mean, it's very special, because he tended to perform the lead role in his own plays. I would say he was like a modern Moliere. And it didn't translate well unless you had, if you had on-stage translation, as my friend Ron was doing, very daring to be there on stage with Faux, translating as he performed his one-man show. Did anyone see that? Anyone see his plays? You don't know his work? No.
Is any of it online?
Yeah, I think you can see little samples of things. And certainly the scripts are now all translated into English, so you can get a hold of plays like Accidental Death of an Anarchist or Mr. Obufo, his best known. But it's not as good to read them as to see them, obviously, because
How was the translation set up?
On
physically?
stage? Well, Fo rehearsed with my friend and Rame too. So Ron had more or less memorized. He knew he was fluent in Italian, but he had his own English text memorized. So Fo would speak a sentence or two or three, and then Ron would speak it in English. And you'd hear first the people who knew Italian would laugh once, at the Italian, then everybody else would laugh at the English afterwards.
Sort of kills
but it was,
the pace of the production.
yeah, it's not quite the same as just uninterrupted performance. But there were also, this is a whole other story about American productions of Fo in English, as my wife is saying in the chat. Without Fo, there were attempts to create his best plays with American actors, and they would often cast a comedian or a comic actor in the lead role. I don't know if you know Jeff Hoyle of San Francisco. He was a Pickle Family circus clown who also became an actor. He played the Fo role, the lead role in Accidental Death in San Francisco. There was a Broadway production of the same play, which did not do well at all. And here's another little story. Because the Broadway production of Accidental Death of an Anarchist did not do so well, it was not so well produced. Fo was unhappy with the English translation. So since I knew everyone involved, I was called up by Fo's agent, along with my friend Ron Jenkins, to meet with Dario Fo and create a new translation for publication. So I got to spend more time with Fo and Franco Rame as they went over the existing English language translation and created a new one. So if you find the Samuel French edition of this play, you'll see my name somewhere in there as one of the collaborators or whatever. But it was fascinating to see him work on this translation, because at one point he said, I want to write a new prologue to this play. And he just improvised a prologue on the spot, and we wrote it down. And I've been told that he would do this in performance sometimes in Italy. In the middle of one of his plays, he'd create a new speech. And the rest of the cast didn't know it was coming, but they were kind of used to him. So they just waited till he finished and then go on with the rest of the play. But to me, that's another example of great satire, an ability to improvise and respond to the moment. It was very immediate, and Fo's plays did that. They were very timely, and he would do also plays that weren't in a theater when there were trials that the public couldn't get into. He would perform with Franca outside the courthouse after a day in court. He would show the public what had gone on in the courtroom in his own version.
Well, that's kind of thing, making up speeches in the middle of the play, going with whatever is happening, comes right out of the Italian tradition of commedia dell'arte.
Yeah, he certainly knew all those traditions.
Sure.
Which play, what was the name of the play that you worked on this translation for?
Accidental Death of an Anarchist.
Oh.
That I would say that's his best known play. And as I say, it's one I published in 1979, and subsequently it went to Broadway, I don't know, 4 or 5 years later.
Wow.
But the reason it went to Broadway was because it was first done in England, and it was very successful in England. The producer wouldn't have done it if it hadn't been done elsewhere first. But I think a lot was lost in translation for his work, and without him in the lead role, it was a problem.
Who do you two consider a great writer about theater and a terrible writer about theater?
That's a great question. I wanted to do, there are two critics who've inspired me, if you call them critics. I don't know if you can see this on camera. There's one book, Shakespeare, Our Contemporary, by Jan Kott. I don't know if you've heard of it.
Robin has, I'm sure.
It was written in the 1960s by this Polish critic who I got to know when he came to the United States. He was eventually banned by the Communist Party in Poland and became a refugee in the United States, taught at Yale and Stony Brook, and I happened to teach at both places too. Kott was a great critic who wrote from his own experience about Shakespeare. He survived the Nazi and Soviet authoritarianism. And when he read Shakespeare, he saw those kinds of horrors in Shakespeare. And he wrote essays about, he called it Shakespeare, Our Contemporary. His most influential essay in this book may have been called King Lear or Endgame, where he talked about how King Lear has a kind of Beckettian quality to it. When the director Peter Brook read this essay, he said, I'm going to do King Lear as Jan Kott says it should be seen. And so Brook did his own production of Lear after Kott, and it was a very interesting production. This is an example of a critic influencing how theater is created. The other influential writing, I think, that was very important to me is Brecht's writing on theater. There's a book, Brecht on Theater, which to me has been a Bible for years and years. But I'll stop there and let Chris.
Yeah. Okay. Well, when you ask Paula about critics that I like and don't like, if you want to put it that way, the first name that comes to mind is Frank Rich, who was known as the Butcher of Broadway when he was writing criticism for the New York Times, and he is the antithesis of what I consider good criticism, because there's two things. One is critics who just like to slam what they don't like. And then a subset of that is critics who want to make jokes at other people's expense, who want to be seen as clever and witty. I like clever and witty. I thought Ben Bradley was very clever and witty when he was writing for the Times. But that's often to the detriment of letting the reader know what's going on, what is the show about. A lot of you have to assume that a lot of the readers are not going to see the show that you're writing about. So, part of the critic's job is to let them in on that experience to the extent as possible, and then let them know what your own opinion is. That was my credo when I was writing criticism. A little sidebar, parenthesis, I'm not writing reviews of plays anymore. And I have to confess that nowadays nowadays it's been 3 months since I stopped, 5 months since I stopped, but sitting in the audience, I find myself saying, I'm so glad I don't have to write about this. I'm still looking at it critically, but I don't have the notebook on my knee. I'm not thinking ahead to what am I going to say about this? How am I going to, and writing down little phrases that I can use in the review. I'm looking at somebody right now who writes about theater, and Robin, your book about Shakespeare and Erasmus is not only fascinating, but really useful and entertaining, because part of the job of a critic, by the way, is also to be entertaining and not just write a scholarly essay on the play you just saw. But Robin's book, and you're going to have to remind me what the actual title is.
Shakespeare's Classroom.
Lessons from Shakespeare's Classroom.
That's right.
Empowering learning through drama and rhetoric.
Indeed. Yeah, it's about Shakespeare's youth in the grammar school, where they did where the lessons in rhetoric were from Erasmus's little sketches, and it's fascinating to know that. And anybody who wants to talk about how Shakespeare couldn't have possibly written those plays because he wasn't educated has to read Robin's book.
Yeah,
and everybody else as well.
Yeah.
That question of finding readers is one we might go into at some point, because I think the whole climate for writing about theater has changed with the advent of the internet and social media. And I don't know, Chris, if you had that experience with your newspaper, but I've found that books about, and Robin, maybe you can comment on this, books about the theater don't have the readership they used to. Maybe they never had a great readership, but my experience is that the only people who read books about theater are either friends of the author or other academics or some theater professionals who take an interest, but it's very rare in my experience that a book about theater will reach a larger readership than a limited sphere of influence. And I don't know if anyone else wants to comment on that, but it's disappointing in a certain way. I mean, having done this over a period of 40 years, I would say 35 years ago, I had some great experiences publishing books about the theater. It's not the same today. It's very different.
But theater is really limited to people with money now because it's so expensive, live theater. And so people don't take their children to theater. You know, it's very, very rare that you see children in theater because it's expensive. If you're going to go to theater and pay $90 a ticket, you're not going to take your two kids. And so family theater has disappeared. So we don't have a generation of children growing up with the habit of attending theater. So our audiences are shrinking, and of course, television and movies. So I wonder if you think that might be the cause of that readership diminishing.
Yeah, that's one. But I think my experience, you know, I was also teaching theater, literature, history for 35, 40 years. And in academia, I think books are used by students only, you know, out of dire necessity. They'd much rather read text messages or see something visual that's not a book. So the function of textbooks has changed over the years too. Not that I feel I ever wrote textbooks, but that kind of scholarly or historical reading has really declined as far as I can tell.
Was that true of graduate students as well? Like in your MA program?
Well, I think in theater, it's become such a specialized field, you know, among doctoral students. You know, they're very specialized, and I think they'll read about their own specialty, but that's about it, as far as I can tell.
I was going to talk about two theater experiences that I had, both of which were special. One was horrible. Both were in New York City, and was the Automobile Graveyard, which I had read and was very interested in. I thought it was a bit beyond me because of the style, well, whatnot. Anyway, I wanted to see this play. And so it was held on the second floor of a kind of rickety old building. I was with two friends, one of whom had the flu very badly, but she wanted to come out with us. So the performance itself was shapeless. It involved a lot of people screaming in a dark, you know, the lights would go on and off and whatnot. And, you know, finally it got to the end, and everyone in the audience was stupefied by then. So I started clapping because I realized it was the end. And so everyone else clapped also. And then everyone sat there. And so I got up and left, and then other people got up and left. I mean, and we rescued our friend, who was, you know, her temperature probably had, you know, exploded during that performance. Okay, so that was a bad one. The other I went to more recently, it was during the AIDS epidemic, the height of it. And a friend of mine had a ticket to this very special show that happened. It was like a series, but it happened every night or every Saturday maybe. And it was the people who acted in it it started at midnight. So the people who acted in it were Broadway actors and actresses who came after their play that night was done. I got in because my friend had the flu. So he gave me his prized ticket. And it wasn't until you got the ticket that you found out where it was going to be held. And so I go there. And as it happened, I was with this beautiful redheaded actress who wasn't able to act that night because she had laryngitis. But so as we were waiting and sat together, she explained to me what this was all about. So this one guy with his partner put together this ongoing saga about AIDS, and it was called The Taint. And there were songs and dances and all sorts of things. And all of the audience, all the guys with AIDS who went night after night after night, all sang along. And we were invited to sing along also. And so, you know, it involved trying to get a cure for the taint. And so there was a lot of satire of bureaucracy and of people, you know, like Ronald Reagan, I mean, conservative, Jesse Helms type people, but always put into the framework of this ongoing, amazing saga. And so that was one of my greatest experiences of New York theater. And both of them were these weird productions that probably not many people saw. In the case of the Automobile Graveyard, I hope not many people had to sit through it. But anyway, I just wanted to throw that in as something so interesting. I certainly would have liked to see both of them reviewed. I should actually go online and look for reviews of the Automobile Graveyard.
When you mention this group play about AIDS and describe it, it seems to me that the qualities of satire that you've found in there are what I would like to see in good satire, something that fosters a community of support for certain views and needs. And I think in my book about satire, the most recent one, I talk about how from Aristophanes on, effective satire has sort of mobilized a community, united it in laughter and a kind of solidarity of support for the author's attack on corruption or hypocrisy or greed. And I think theater is capable of bringing people together that way. I suppose tragedy and other forms can do that as well, but it seems to me satire does that in a very gratifying way when it's effective.
It seems to me that the late night talk shows, Stephen Colbert and Jimmy Kimmel, who's my favorite, but all of the others have a community of which we, the audience, are a part. But they're in there in the theater and they laugh when we laugh and we all get the same jokes. And so in some sense that, and Saturday Night Live too, I guess is like that.
Yeah, I wrote about that too in the book. I mentioned that I think live theater has the advantage over, say, Saturday Night Live, and that if you have an audience of, say, 17,000 people laughing together, it's a much greater experience just in terms of size and shared community than it would be if you're sitting in front of your television set laughing. And in that sense, live satire really does give us something that electronic media can't provide in terms of that live community we join in the experience.
Well, Paula, as you say, when it's kind of half and half. When you're sitting in front of the TV and you're laughing along with the performers and the studio audience, it's easy to feel part of that, and there is really a connection. But it's also really easy to feel not part of that, to remember that you're in your room alone. And so it's, you know, it's obviously better than sitting in your room alone, not sharing anything. But
I never sit in my room alone. Carrie is always there.
Oh, yeah.
And he gets very few of the jokes. which pisses me off a great deal. So he's not part of our community, our
Okay.
Saturday Night Live community.
Right.
Tony, what were you gonna say? Unmute yourself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Different things come to mind. One thing I think is something you were saying, Joel, in terms of, when these Greek, when Aristophanes plays would come on, there'd be what, 40,000 people, you were saying?
17 to 20,000. No.
Okay. But this is in a country with a population at that point, if I'm not mistaken, around 250,000?
That's right. Yeah, it's a small city in that sense.
With a lot of people going to see these plays. I mean,
definitely.
Aristotle is writing about Sophocles, Euripides, Aeschylus, basically 100 years after they perform.
Even less than that, a few years. It wasn't that long after.
Okay, but he probably didn't see a lot of those plays that he was writing about.
Oh, he did. Yes, Aristophanes saw Euripides.
I was thinking more of Euripides, Sophocles.
He would have.
I was thinking he was maybe this is where I'm asking you about, because I was thinking he came quite a bit later.
No, if you know the play The Frogs, 405 BC, was written just after the death of Euripides, I believe. And it's a play where the god of theater, Dionysus, goes to Hades to bring back a playwright, and he wants Euripides back. Euripides has just died, and he misses him. So he knew the plays of Euripides very well, and in that sense, it was a very contemporary, timely play about. It also refers to living playwrights that he makes fun of, but when he quotes Euripides and brings Euripides on stage to debate Aeschylus, the audience would have known those plays, if not the playwrights.
Exactly. And my point was that we don't have that sort of community, that larger community of knowing in terms of the theater. Going back to what Robin was talking about, it only gets to be wealthy people who go to the theater. And I think there's a lot of people writing for a theater that they can get their plays produced in. So there gets to be this sort of aristocratic, this sort of higher, whatever it is, that's this level of remove that theater has, I don't think is the purpose of theater. The purpose of theater is to somehow sort of engage, and going back to what you were talking to Paula about in terms of the TV show stuff, or maybe it was Chris, I'm not too sure. That doesn't have that immediacy of the live performance.
That's a very good point, and I think but you seem to be talking more about Broadway and New York theater.
Not necessarily Broadway, even the regional theater.
Even regional theaters don't seem to be that.
I go to the regional theaters, and you see the same people for the most part.
Really,
the plays are not a large part of. They're not going to change people's minds. In 2001 October, I was in Chile. I was in Chile to direct a play, and my Spanish was not good. And I was listening to this one man. I was sitting in with this play, this one man show that this guy was doing. He had been in prison during the Pinochet period, and there was a question and answer thing afterwards.
It was in Spanish.
In Spanish, and I'm sitting with my friend and I hear something 9/11, something 9/11, and everybody applauds. And I'm sitting in the front row. I'm taller than everybody else. I'm sort of trying to shrink down. And I asked my friend what that was about. And we referred to some graffiti that this guy had seen. That which you do will be done unto you. 9/11. 9/11 being also the date that Pinochet coup happened. And I was working in a theater in Dayton at that time. And all I could think was, they're in the process of finding out a season of plays to do in Dayton. And all I knew for certain was They would have nothing to do with squat. They would not be irrelevant. They would not somehow threaten the place where we are in this country. And yet this mobilization of energies around going to war in Afghanistan at that point, without a real sense of any real sense of the history around that. The purpose of theater being to somehow engage those discussions, engage those ideas. It just sort of hit me with this sort of powerful force of that.
Yeah, I think it's an excellent point you're making. The lack of community engagement that is something that's really hurting theater today in many places. And I think maybe one reason satire has appealed to me is engagement is built into that form. It's not going to work with an audience unless it's addressing the concerns of that audience. So in that sense, it represents a very effective form of theater, and it may be dying out because we don't have communities that can support that kind of theater or welcome it.
In the title of your conversation is theater writing, but you haven't talked very much about playwriting. Could you talk about that? I mean, about writing plays for the theater. I guess not.
Well,
okay, let's move on.
I think that when Chris and I write about plays, we comment on the quality of the playwriting and prefer certain forms of playwriting. I don't think we're advocating somebody should go and write a certain kind of play, but I think we're responding to plays and saying, this is a well-written play, this is a well-staged play, that kind of thing.
And people reading my stuff have often asked, so, you write about plays, do you write plays? Do you have the ambition to write plays? And I generally say no, because I know that I wouldn't be as good at it as the plays that I really enjoy seeing. I've worked with playwrights dramaturgically, working with them on their scripts from the point of view of structure and the scene is much too long kind of thing. But I personally don't have the ambition to write a play, except for the ones we were talking about earlier before you all joined us about the plays that I wrote in the third grade. and I've learned from since.
They were very well received.
And Paula and Barry were in a couple of them in grass skirts.
Yeah.
I wrote a few plays, but then I became a play reader for a couple of theaters, the American Place Theater in New York, and then the Yale Rep. And after a while, I decided if someone submitted my plays to me at these theaters, I'd probably reject them. So I did not think my writing of plays was as high a quality as I would have liked. Although I did direct one of my plays. Since the newspapers won't report it as news, maybe they'll report it as theater if we begin to think of it in terms of being both theater and political protest.
Well, that's such a telling comment that's just political theater.
Yeah.
I mean, in my experience, all great theater is political, all of it.
I agree.
It's the very essence of great theater that it's political. So that comment that's just political theater is obviously written by somebody who just goes to musicals.
It's done a lot in Washington, D.C. People who want to dismiss their opponents will say, oh, he's just creating political theater. Yeah. So it's actually in political discourse that's used that way.
Right, it's become this derogatory term. Which, two things. One, that very day there were 100 such demonstrations, over 100 throughout the country, and the one in Washington D.C. that Bill McKibben and Third Act organized this third act is for climate activists over 60. So they all were in rocking chairs in front of the Chase Bank or something like that. So yeah, theatricality is an important part of that. And then I just wanted to add that writings about the theater by theater practitioners. I mean, certainly I considered Brecht on theater a Bible. My Brecht on theater was falling apart at the end of my career, definitely. I still, the other book that for me is teaching directing, I always started them reading Peter Brook's The Empty Space, which really, because the profundity of the 4 categories he sets up, and especially that first chapter, The Deadly Theater, thinking back to, things, I think the automobile graveyard sounded like a prime example of deadly theater that Brooke would have used. And I'm glad Diana brought John Simon in, because he also was a critic who was known for really not loving theater. Okay, so, there you go.
On this Backstage series, we've had Robin Rice from New York, who's written a gazillion plays, some of which Chris directed in 2016 when we had Antioch Alumni Reunion on theater and performance. That was the theme, which are delightful. I wish she had joined us. Also, Nancy Meckler was on, who's written a book, a really wonderful book on, God, I forget what it's called. On directing? No, I don't know. I don't think so. Is that what it's called?
Yes. Yeah. I don't know if it's.
But that's what it's about, and about the theater groups companies that she worked with in the UK. And then this coming Saturday will be Louis Tyrrell, who has basically developed theater in Florida and has had, I think he said, something like 150 plays by new playwrights performed. And he now is affiliated with Florida Atlantic University and runs a theater lab, which does much of the same. And if you go, I don't know if you get our invitations and reminders and whatnot of these programs, but they say a lot about the work that he's doing. And then Jessica, who has been a theater manager for 40 years, something like
50.
that. 50. She's going to be in conversation with him. So that should be quite interesting. And then I'll just give a little preview. There's a current initiative at Antioch to develop the theater. And this has been a long, long time coming. I mean, 2007 is when the university closed the college. Barry happened to go to that reunion, and that's when we started advocating for the theater as one of the things that would draw publicity, support, revenue, etc. And now, what is it, 15 years later, they're actually going to treat the theater as a revenue stream, which is, kind of an iffy proposition, but we won't tell them that. But also it will be a site of study, and it will be, I think they call it a learning hub, one of a few on campus. And so a wonderful guy named Chris Westhoff is who's been the advancement director at the Antioch School, has been working with the theater. He took over Jeff Hooper's theater, Mad River Theater Company, and has brought Mad River to Yellow Springs, and they put on a play that played in Yellow Springs at the Foundry and took it on tour. interestingly, it's a play about abolition, the abolitionist movement. The original play was told from the point of view of Northern white abolitionists. And Chris said to Jeffrey Hooper, who was still manager at the time, that he thought the slaves should be part of the play, part of the discourse. And Jeffrey, that's the point that they split up, because Jeffrey thought the script, the original script, should not be messed with. So Chris basically, I think, wrote, or the company wrote, a play about abolition from the point of view of the slaves. And it ran in Yellow Springs, got an excellent review in the Yellow Springs News. And he and Antioch have come to an agreement where for the next year, he's going to manage the Foundry. And actually, it's up to us alumni to raise $35,000 toward that effort, which we intend to do and probably raise it by the end of the year, end of the calendar year. But it's really exciting. I mean, after all this time and everyone saying, you know, theater is dead at Antioch, all this, we're so, and he's energetic, he's fabulous. Barry and Jessica and I and Phil King and Patty Dallas worked closely with him on the 100th anniversary of the Antioch School, which was an event last October that he directed, and we helped, you know, formulate what was going to happen and what kind of event it would be. But he's got energy, he's got political savvy, he's very charming, and he has a ton of experience in most aspects of theater, including set construction and acting. Anyway, he's going to come on at the tail end of Jessica and Lewis's conversation this Saturday. So if you can join us, do. I think it'll be really great.
I would say too that the theater at Antioch and Yellow Spring and beyond Antioch, there was that center stage theater that got started, that you have closer ratio of people watching the theater to the population of the village that they come from, is much closer to what you were talking about in Greece, with the 17,000 watching from a population of 250,000.
Oh, I see the proportion of people who would come to theater.
Yeah.
So they can do Aristophanes there.
Yeah. So I was in the Frogs when they did it at Antioch. And actually, oh, well, I won't go into my personal story, but
it's a great story though, Paula, but don't tell it.
No.
Okay, other comments before we wind up? Well, we still have some time. Yeah.
I may have missed this because sometimes Joel froze, but I wanted to know if, because I know the work of Dario Fo and I don't know why I know it. Was he in, was the San Francisco meme troupe involved with Dario Fo at all?
They did one of his plays. They did We Can't Pay, We Won't Pay. Well, I think in the late 70s, early 80s. So
yeah,
if you were watching them, you saw that.
Yeah, that's what it was. Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
And
Joan, straight out of his tradition.
Yes, yes. And Joan Holden, who was their principal playwright for 30 years, also did a version of Accidental Death of an Anarchist, which was done in the Bay Area. So it's possible you could have seen that
So
too.
there was a connection there, yeah.
But yes, he got his hearing in Berkeley and San Francisco.
Well, maybe we're done.
Well, thank you all for participating.
Yeah, thank you for putting this back together.
And thank you.